keep on running. I keep on running. I keep on running. Running. Non-stop till they out of breath. Putting in about 1,000 reps. Addicted to the grind like a pound of meth. Tonight I rock my line of how I climb the best.
Welcome to the Football Camino. It is such a pleasure to be with you all today, wherever in the world you are listening. The Football Camino is dedicated to taking you on a football journey with football's most interesting players, coaches, trainers, club personnel, and journalists. Think of these as mini autobiographies. Each guest will show you how they got where they are now, reveal their techniques for success, and what they've learned along the way. Our guest today is journalist and author James Montague. Montague has written 3 books and 1 ebook, including When Friday Comes, Football in the War Zone, the revision of that book, When Friday Comes, Football, War, and Revolution in the Middle East, Ultras, How Egypt's Football Fans Toppled the Dictator, and 31 Nil, On the Road with Football's Outsiders, which won him Best Football Book at the 2015 British Sports Book of the Year Awards. His new book, The Billionaires Club, The Unstoppable Rise of Football's Super Rich Owners, comes out this August. He regularly writes for GQ, Bleacher Report, CNN, World Soccer, The New York Times, and appears on the BBC World Service's World Football Show. This is part 1 of my 2-part interview with him. In this episode, he talks about getting in trouble as a youth, his keys to pitching a story, how he finds original story ideas, playing summer football in the Sahara, spending the day in a Russian jail cell, and how he almost got assaulted by riot police in Gaza. Since James was in Serbia at the time of the interview, the audio cuts out a couple times, and I apologize for the technical issues. So without further ado, sit back and enjoy our conversation. It's a pleasure to be with you. It's such a joy ever since you said you were okay with doing the podcast. How are you doing today?
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good. I mean, it's a beautiful sunny day in Belgrade. I'm just planning the next trip to watch some World Cup qualifiers. That's the good thing about the Balkans. It's always great football on. And so this weekend you've got the World Cup qualifiers and you've got Serbia playing Wales, Serbia top of their group, they're playing in Belgrade, Kosovo playing Turkey, which would be a great game, they're playing in northern Albania, you've got Montenegro playing Armenia in Podgorica, you've got Bosnia playing, it's like, it's this little buffet of international football that's right up my street, so I think I found myself in the right part of the world for now anyway.
Yeah, before we get into your past and your childhood, how did you end up in Serbia?
Well, as with most people, foreign men in Belgrade that you meet, it's always a woman. And so as it happened with me, I met my girlfriend, who's not Serbian, she's Dutch, and she's the Balkans correspondent for the Dutch equivalent of the BBC, so the NOS. And I actually met her on a football pitch in Kosovo. Bizarrely, she'd never done a football story before, and I was there to do a story about Kosovo's first ever, not official game, but they weren't members then, but they were given the permission by FIFA to play other FIFA members. So they played Haiti, of all teams, in the northern city of Mitrovica, and it was a big historic event. And I remember there's a place called Obilic, which is in central Kosovo, and it's one of the most polluted areas in Europe. They have this big factory, this kind of power station that just belches out the kind of acrid yellow smoke. It's one of the most disgusting places I've ever been. And I was on the pitch expecting to, there's so few Western journalists that ever cover the stories I do because they seem so obscure. And I turn up thinking, I'm going to go interview these new players and a coach and this great story. And then there was this woman was there already that had already been there interviewing everybody. And I was like, who the hell are you? What are you doing on my story? And then, so we met and I fell in love. And so she lived here. And if I wanted to be with her, I had to be here. So I moved here. We have a baby. And so that's how I've ended up here. But as it turns out, I'd already had spent a little bit of time in the region and wrote a little bit about Serbia and Croatia and the Yugoslav war in my second book, 31 Nil. So I've always been fascinated by the region, and it's just a football and sports mad place that has a very interesting history and a very interesting future given Trump's election in the US, and that's kind of shaking things up here a little bit as well. So it's kind of the right time to be here, fascinating time to be here, and the people are lovely as well. It's a great country, great city as well.
Yeah, I mean, what are the odds? I'm just blown away by the odds of that sort of thing happening. But I mean, I guess that's how life goes sometimes. I
mean, like everybody's got a story about how they meet their other half, right? And it's always, I mean, unless you meet on Tinder, I suppose in a way Tinder is random, but this is the pure life, you know. And it was so funny because she'd never done a football story. It was literally her first football story, and she ended up getting pregnant off the back of it. I'm not sure she's done any more. So
yeah, first and last one.
Yeah.
So where did you grow up, and what was your childhood like?
Well, I grew up in Essex, which is very close to London. Often when I go abroad, I just say London because people assume that I'm just saying sex. It just sounds, you know, one of those words that doesn't translate well in foreign countries. So I just say London often, unless the person's from London, in which case they usually say that Essex people spend all their lives pretending to be from London. And so I grew up there, city now called Chelmsford, has a terrible football team. One of those football teams that's kind of bumped around in the non-leagues for ages. And I had, I grew up with very little money. I didn't have, I went to state school. It was a great childhood before the internet, really. I mean, I only really discovered, I think I went on the first time I ever went on the internet was when I was about 17 or 16, and Weezer had like some kind of like early web page that had, you know, some of its music on it, and you could barely play it because it was all dial-up modems. So it was kind of like a idyllic childhood interspersed with kind of various arrests from the police for cheeky criminal damage and drunken disorderlies. But it was a different time then because you could kind of like make mistakes as a kid then. I mean, you did like now, if you get into trouble with the police or if you get like, you know, if you're running with a bad crowd, you get into trouble once and it's a blot on your record. And that isn't taken into account, you know, Facebook, what people put on when they're 13, they're usually held to account later on in life. So yeah, I had like a fun, very kind of chaotic, almost anarchic kind of childhood, which I escaped. A very loving family, but I mean, in terms of kind of getting into trouble and stuff and getting expelled from school and all that. But yeah, somehow came out the other end of it and ended up getting myself into university and was just fascinated with the world and politics, international politics in particular. And that's what I studied. And I came out of that not really knowing what I wanted to do. I didn't know I wanted to be a journalist. I knew it wanted to be something in the world of politics or something that had a kind of wide lens on the world. And eventually, found myself doing a work experience at the New Statesman, which is, for any of your listeners who might not know, is kind of a left of centre weekly political magazine, very famous, set up in part by George Bernard Shaw. And so I went there, did work experience, and just completely fell in love with journalism. I just thought, this is what I want to dedicate my life to. And it was only later that I kind of put kind of journalism, politics, and sport together, and ended up kind of following that line, which is not. I mean, I'm not the first person by any means to do that. I mean, I was reading Simon Cooper and Dave Goldblatt, and you read other authors like that have kind of done that. And then I decided that was what I wanted to pursue with my life.
And so when you said you were getting into trouble as a youth, as like a teenager, what do we mean by that? You know, I don't want to like implicate you in too many crimes, you know, but like, what does that mean?
If you grew up, you grew up in a fairly kind of dull place, and you know, with your mates and you're out, and it was like boozing, drinking on the streets, you know, like causing trouble. Like none of it was malicious. It was just like, you know, I remember the first time I ever got nicked, I think I was 13, and I got arrested trying to take a a sign off of a building site. It was a really cool sign. It was one of those blue signs, and a guy had a yellow kind of sound mufflers on. And I thought, yeah, that looked great on my wall. And I remember taking some wire cutters and cutting it down, and the police car just went past and said, "What are you doing?" It didn't even cross my mind that it would be illegal to take that. But yeah, so it was kind of that kind of stuff. I mean, it was mainly every time I got into trouble with the police, it was kind of like being smart, like trying to talk back to them. Like in my house, Dad was very keen on me to read, and we always had books, and so I thought I was smarter than I was. So I'd always come up with some kind of legal justification as to why they shouldn't arrest me, which obviously angered them more, and then obviously took me away and took me to the police cells for the evening. But it was all kind of like cheeky stuff. But I mean, it was always given a caution, so it was never any. There's never any kind of permanent mark on my record, which is amazing, because if this was today, I mean, you'd be that's it. You'd probably have some tag on you. But in that kind of environment, which was kind of like early to mid 90s, you were given the space to make kind of mistakes, and I mean, it wasn't anything particularly bad, but I mean, it was still nice to be able to kind of emerge from that, and you grow up and you realise, oh God, that was so stupid. You're so juvenile for kind of getting involved in that kind of behaviour. But a lot of people don't get the opportunity to then do something in their lives because they have this blot on their copybook, and I was lucky not to have that. But that's purely just out of blind luck and being born in the era that I was born into.
Yeah, I mean, like, even for myself, like, I mean, it's also, the area you grow up in, sometimes, police are more lax. Like, if everything that I had done, like, was caught and tagged on my record, like, God, I would be so unemployable at this point.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm kind of unemployable. I mean, I haven't had a job I'm pure freelance, and I've chosen for it to be that way because I'm not very good with bosses in general, so I worked out quite quickly that it's best just to work for yourself. And I think that equally, I mean part of it was that, and the other part was the fact that there were just so few jobs in journalism that it's very difficult to break in. That's why I started off being a freelancer, because I worked out that to get a job, I sent off so many applications and got absolutely nowhere, even like kind of very kind of low positions on local newspapers. But you could email GQ, and if you had a good idea, they'd commission you if it was good enough. And I found it was incredible. Like, freelance writing was incredibly meritocratic, but journalism jobs and the industry of journalism wasn't. It was the exact opposite. It was about patronage and nepotism and all sorts of things. So it was incredibly kind of unequal and unfair kind of industry, and that's why I think you see journalism in Britain in particular, and in the States as well, is kind of dominant people whose parents have money. But freelance journalism is very different, because it is a marketplace of ideas, and actually you're not going to get commissioned if it's just because somebody and it's a terrible idea. They literally, you live and die on the idea and how you execute it. So there is some kind of meritocratic system to it, even though it seems there are other issues with freelancers. I mean, the fact that getting money out of people is always very difficult. But for anybody who's starting out, I would still recommend that this is a path. It is possible to do. I've just about got to a position where I can and not be looking over my shoulder. I mean, it's taken a few years to build it, and can find your niche. Then you can be a freelancer. You don't have to get a staff job.
When you're selling your stories freelance, how do you sell them? Do you have like a specific method?
Basically, I found that one thing I was good at was pitching. Pitching is absolutely essential. Basically, you've got to put an idea in a way that the person that you're pitching to would read it, for one. It would open that email, and that within 3 paragraphs, you've got to sell him or her on that idea. And I found that, essentially you make it the opening paragraph of your pitch should be good enough to use as an opening paragraph of your article. So I always write the pitch as if I'm writing the article, like setting the scene or a description of somebody or something, so that if they read that, then the reader would read that, and a commissioning editor would read that, and anybody would read that and continue reading. And usually the first pitch just sets the scene, second pitch explains second paragraph explains the story, third paragraph explains how you can do it. Very very concise, very richly kind of like worded. You've got to do a bit of research, obviously, and find out a little bit about it before you do it. So it's not something. I mean, the more you know people after a while, the less you have to kind of do that. Once, like, I've got a good relationship with a couple of people, I can just say, look, I'm going to this place. There's this person I want to interview. Could be quite an interesting story. What do you think? But that comes a bit later. But in the initial pitching to people, and bear in mind that everybody that I've written for, I mean, this is whether it's GQ or New York Times or anyone, Esquire, CNN, they've all been kind of cold pitches. They've just, it's not that I've known anybody there. It's not that anybody's kind of said, you should contact this guy. I've got the email address of the right person and sent them the idea, and that gives me kind of hope that it's not just anything in particularly special about me. It's just that if you get to the right person and it's a good idea and you've got a good plan to do it, and then once it's commissioned, you succeed in making it good enough for them to publish, then that is possible for almost anybody. There's no journalism is an extremely tough industry to get into, but it is a marketplace of ideas, and good ideas do shine out, and people who can actually act on them and do them are actually very rare. And I only really worked this out from me and a couple of friends set up a magazine a few years ago, nothing to do with football. It's called Delayed Gratification, and it's a kind of slow journalism idea that looks at kind of it's quarterly, and it looks back at the news that's just happened with hindsight, like what was the most important thing that the kind of 24-hour news cycle kind of picked up and dropped very quickly. And when you're suddenly I'm on the other end of the fence and getting ideas and being pitched, and then you realise kind of how a lot of people don't really know how to do it properly, and even if they do, sometimes they don't really follow through with it. So if you can be consistent and good in your pitching, and I mean, it's not even hitting deadlines. Hitting deadlines is important, although I'm terrible at it. But if you tell them that you do something and you do it to a really good standard, that's actually fairly rare, which sounds crazy because you'd think that everybody was up to that standard, but it's not. There's a lot of it's very difficult to find good people. So it is possible to write for almost anybody. You just have to find the right email address and present it to them in a concise and very readable way, as if you're approaching a reader.
What's the number one mistake that either you made when you were starting out, or that a lot of people make when pitching stories? Well,
I mean, there's a great example of this. I mean, it's not doing your research. So I remember I had after I did my work experience at the New Statesman, I had to, because I was working at the time, I was doing that work experience. It was a free work experience, which is crazy really to have, because obviously people of poorer backgrounds are excluded. But I was lucky. I used to sell double glazing door to door in Essex. So I had evening shifts of doing that, and then I'd go in during the day and work, in this incredibly kind of elite, liberal, metropolitan environment. And it was quite an interesting juxtaposition. But I was lucky I could work and do that, but I couldn't do that forever because I'd go crazy. So I had a job. It was kind of in lobbying, weirdly. It was a political job and not much money, but it was a proper job in London. So I had to take that. And in my lunch hour, I'd pitch stories to people and hope that I could get some stuff. And I remember writing to 442, the British football magazine, and I thought it was an amazing story. And I remember the editor at the time, Hugh Slate, wrote back and absolutely slated my pitch. He said, "We wrote this in last month's magazine. You should know that. If you're pitching me as a new person, you've got to do your research, and you've got to make sure that I will open that email again if you send it to me." And it was humiliating. It was humiliating getting that email. And I thought, okay, well, he's absolutely right. So I got back copies of the magazine, made sure that the stories I wanted to pitch weren't in there, and I made damn sure that when I pitch somebody in future, that it's something that they've never done before. And I wrote him back again and said, look, I've got this other story idea. What do you think of that? And he commissioned me the second time. And that's the second thing that you learn as well, is that people give up because they're embarrassed or they don't take advice very well. But if you get any kind of reply from anybody who commissions you, hit them back straight away with more ideas, with, cause once you've got that communication channel that's opened up, it's very, it's much easier to make things happen than if there isn't one.
And so was this before you ended up going to Time Out Dubai?
Yeah, this was all before. I was like doing this job. I was it was like 9 to 5 job, extremely unhappy, trying desperately to get some kind of traction. I was studying for an NCTJ so I was working there doing an NCTJ, which is kind of like a technical qualification for journalism. So you learn shorthand, the law, that kind of thing. I was studying that on an evening on a Wednesday and on a Saturday as well, and then using all my holiday to take unpaid work experience. I went to the Independent on Sunday and a couple of other places. So desperately trying to get some kind of job. And none of it was happening. But what I was getting was commissions from quite big magazines. So I did a couple of things for GQ. I remember I did a football story for GQ, and there was Jack magazine, which was a short-lived magazine that was from the guy who used to be the editor of Loaded, called Jack, which was supposed to be like a thinking men's magazine. And yeah, it was. I wasn't really getting anywhere in terms of being able to pay the rent in London. But then, I saw this advert for Time Out Dubai, and it was a shopping and fashion editor. And I thought, well, fuck it, why not? And I sent off an application form, didn't hear anything back. A couple of months later, I got an email saying, can you send us a restaurant review? I sent them the restaurant review, and next thing I know, they've called me, and they've asked me to come out there 2 weeks later. And when I got out there, I realised why. It's because in a lot of places, and this is something I would heartily recommend to any journalist, anywhere in the world really, is to get away from their home environment, which is extremely tough to break into, and go to English language publications and websites and countries that have them, and work on them. So, I mean, for one, there's less competition. Two, they're more likely to take a risk on young, unproven journalists who show a glimmer of kind of talent. And the fact you even travel to the country in the first place usually shows a lot of willing. And these are the places where you can learn your trade and learn and make your mistakes as well. And you make your mistakes far away from kind of prying eyes. And I made shitloads of mistakes, but luckily not a lot of them were online. So I kind of went out there, and that was kind of the start of kind of everything really. And I was just, any journalist who's finding it tough kind of breaking into it and has tried blogging and tried all sorts of things and finding it very difficult, I would say, go to it, find a country, ideally somewhere that you have some kind of connection. Originally, I thought maybe go to Poland because my mum was Polish, and maybe I applied to a few Polish magazines, English language magazines in Poland, because I thought I had some kind of basis of the language. I could go out there, and in the end, it was Dubai, which English is the lingua franca there. But there's all sorts of places that you can go. I mean, a second language is very useful, but not absolutely necessary. You can learn that on the job. But yeah, it was a bit of a hustle, but getting out to Dubai, that was the first journalism job I've ever had and the last journalism job I've ever had. But those 2.5 years were absolutely essential to learning what it really meant to be a journalist.
And what are some of the lessons you learned, and how did you take you weren't writing about football, but how did that experience, even just writing about the arts and restaurants, how did you apply that to your football writing? Well,
so when you're writing stuff, sometimes I don't really even see it as football writing, because what it is you're finding fascinating stories about people and about kind of institutions and about movements. So I did a couple of stories for Time Out Dubai about football, which were a couple of interesting things. Like I remember when I first arrived there was North Korea turned up for a World Cup qualifier, which was one of the most bizarre things I've ever seen, because the UAE had been knocked out. I think this was qualifying for 2006 for German World Cup, and there was about 5,000 North Korean fans there. And it's illegal for them to leave. I was like, where have these guys come from? It turns out they were working on building sites. There were women there as well who were working, obviously, as maids. And they were all dressed in traditional outfits in this empty stadium, apart from one stand. And they had these little clappers. The women had these clappers on their hands, so it made this clacking sound all the way through, because they didn't want to rough up their delicate hands. They had these kind of these wooden paddles that they would clap with. And I always remember that there was just a line of like North Korean security agents in front of them, not watching the match, but watching them and seeing whether they were behaving themselves. And I thought I wrote something about it, and I thought this is just such a bizarre experience. And that kind of opened my mind a little bit to actually this is a really interesting area of the world to write about. But usually it's always, whether it was I wrote a little bit about punk bands in the Middle East and about heavy metal bands in the Middle East, and it's almost a similar type of story. You're writing about people who are kind of, they're underdogs, they're up against the system, they're trying to, get out there and do something, and what they're doing is representative of something bigger, either of themselves, what they're doing, or of the society that they find themselves in. So I just applied that to football, really. And it was after coming across these incredible stories in Dubai and in the wider Middle East, it was only then that I started really writing almost exclusively about football. But because I studied politics, I was interested in the world, and that was heavily infused. And when I started writing about football, I thought initially that nobody else was doing that, because I didn't see it in any of the magazines I wrote for. And then I remember thinking, I'm going to write a book. I'm going to write a book that explains the Middle East through football. And then that's when I came across Simon Cooper's book, Football Against the Enemy. And I thought, balls, someone's already done it. but he'd done it 10 years ago, and he did it brilliantly, And so, and then I came across all this other literature that was, him, and especially David Goldblatt, their work, and, frankly, to a lesser extent as well. Jonathan Wilson especially, and then I realised, well, I mean, of course, I'm not the first person to do this, and lots of people have done it much better than me, but this is where I want to be, and this is the kind of work I want to do. So, I ended up, while still working, taking holiday, going to Yemen, going to Saudi Arabia, going to Iran, which was, amazing experience going there to see football there. Iraq, this is the worst years of the war, and eventually put together what would eventually become When Friday Comes, which was my first book, and that was when I kind of became a football writer. I felt, even if I don't always feel like I am a football writer, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I totally understand. I mean, it's most of your books are like travel, political, football wrapped into one. But I'm happy you mentioned, so you kind of realized after you had started or had the idea for the book that all of this other literature was out there. But I mean, you've obviously written books since then. How do you know that, I want to not just write a long feature on this, but, for like one of these publications, but no, I want to make this a book?
Well, a lot of them come out of long features because, the fact is, I'm a freelance. I've got to work, and and all these books are incredibly expensive if you break it down at the cost of how much it takes to travel. 31 Nil. That must have taken me to 30 countries. One of them was getting to Samoa to do the story about the American Samoa national team was one of the single longest plane journeys you can take. I'm going from one end of I'm going from the UK to the international date line. I think it took me 4 flights. It took me virtually 24 hours, or actually technically 0, because I got there and realised because I'd crossed the line, it'd gone back a day. So I arrived when I got there. But so a lot of the times, and I'm so grateful for for my commissioning editors as well, because they've been really great about this. I'll write a story or do a BBC radio report, and I'll get paid for that. Maybe even get some of the expenses for it. But I mean, not for the American Samoa trip, I should mention. But it's a way of kind of subsidising what will eventually become a book. And the way it becomes a book is when I feel that there's a wider way of connecting the dots. And often I'll think I'm going to go there with the aim of mainly using this as some form of research for a future book. So 31 Nil was an idea that I'd had originally for the 2010 World Cup. I thought this is a great idea, but I started it a little bit too late, and I wasn't there for the first qualifiers for the 2010 World Cup. So I kind of put it on hold, and when I pitched it again, it was only actually a year later after the World Cup, and I said, I'll definitely be there at the first game. And that's when, then you start thinking, okay, well, so where do I want to go? What kind of stories do I want to tell in the beginning? Of course, you've got to do American Samoa, so you have to work out how to go there. But then you arrange these trips, and then you go on them, and then these incredible stories come out, which if held back just for the book would be great. But I felt that they needed a bigger platform, so I did a story for the New York Times. When I got to Samoa, I found out that when I met the American Samoa national team, that their centre back, Jaya Salur, was a Fafafina, was transgender, and was the first transgender player ever to kind of feature in a World Cup match. And then this incredible story just kind of it comes out of it. They win their first ever game, and I mean, if anyone's seen the film Next Goal Wins.
Yeah, I have. It's a classic.
It's a classic. You can see me in the background because it was just this film crew and me. And I think at first they thought they're really nice lads, but at first I think they thought they had the story to themselves. I think they were a little bit, but in the end it worked out great. I mean, it was the most emotional, wonderful thing to see that. And the way they've done the film, it's not, a lot of people talk about fake news and about documentaries and about selective editing. You didn't need to really edit the storyline because it was like a film. That ending where they almost qualify for the next round and they hit the post in the last minute. It was so filmic watching it. It felt like you're in a film watching it. And with these characters that you just couldn't make them up. I mean, they were just so vivid and real. Like Thomas Rongen, the coach of the American Samoa national team, who'd been the former US under 20s coach and former Ajax youth player that played with Cruyff when he was in the NASL. It was just this wonderful, beautiful thing. But going back to the original point, this, I kind of have one eye on a kind of meta idea and then go about trying to achieve it somehow, because a lot of the times there aren't big advances for books like that, so you've got to kind of hustle it and somehow kind of sort it out. I mean, it's a bit different with the book I've just finished at the moment, The Billionaires Club, which looks at the super rich in football, which I did I had a little bit of an advance that allowed me to kind of travel around in quite a short space of time to do that. But usually it's just you sit down and you think of an idea and then you just go about trying to execute it. And so I'm in the process of working out what I want to do for the next one at the moment.
Yeah, so you say you sit down and think of an idea, which it sounds easier than it is. I used to be a journalism student in university, and the hardest thing for me was always finding inspiration for worthwhile stories and finding something original to write about.
Yeah.
What is your process for doing that?
You read a lot, you pick things up from other places. But you never read something and think, right, I'm going to replicate that I did. For me, that's theft. And also it's not very original and doesn't excite me. But what it does is that it could be, usually it's just a throwaway line in something or a throwaway remark someone's made, and then it plugs into the knowledge that you have of the game, of the region, of the politics, and you think, oh, that's interesting. There was like, for instance, there's a story, I haven't pursued it, but I've been looking into it, of there was rumours that a youth player of Partizan Belgrade had defected from the Serbian national team to the Kosovan national team, which would be a huge story. I'm still working on it. Nobody will talk to me about it. But it was just because there was a line in the Albanian press, and it was through Google Translate, because someone sent me the link, mentioning that this guy had been called up, actually not really mentioning the fact that he played for Serbia at all, but I saw his last name, went back to the Partizan list of players who played for the under-17s team, and there he was. And then you start thinking, because of the issue between Serbia and Albania, and especially about the Albanian majority now in Kosovo, you're thinking, I mean, that's a huge story if that's true. And then you kind of, it's always a little crumb of something that you take and then you build on it. You know, even, or sometimes it's just, you look at an event and you think, God, the person who did that, I want to speak to them and find out why. So a story I did for the New York Times about, for instance, the guy who flew the drone into the stadium when Albania played Serbia with the flag, which almost, it kind of did start a riot. But, I looked at that and I thought, the first thing I saw, like, I want to find that guy. And I tracked him down, because to me, the interesting story isn't the tete-a-tete. It's not even the violence or anything like it. It's what motivated this guy, and how did he achieve this, probably the greatest act of trolling in the history of trolling, and to me, that's kind of the process. It's always something that you look at and you see a little, I don't know, like a, folded up corner that shows a bigger picture, and then it's about pulling that back and creating the rest of that picture for yourself. So it's just keeping plugged into the world and reading, and you'll find that inspiration in the strangest places. It's not always in the sports press. Often it's not ever in the sports press, because that's covered so well. But you just local newspapers, local websites. Something somebody might tell you in the street. You talk older people, especially people who have watched football in the 60s and 70s, have kind of great memories of, and not just football, sports in general. And they'll tell you something about, a game or a team or a player or something like that, and then you think, Christ, I mean, you couldn't imagine that today. And then you go back into the history, and suddenly this whole kind of florid universe of great stories kind of opens up. So I don't know if any of that is useful.
Yeah, no, it totally makes sense. But, it totally makes sense, because it's hard for you as a journalist to know what to look for, but when you're reading, or in this case, talking to someone older, they'll give you the spark, and then you can kind of know where to look. But you can't just say, Google, hey, what's an interesting story I could tell? So that totally makes sense.
When I first started out doing football stories, I remember going to the FIFA website. This is my original form of inspiration, going to the FIFA website and going through the list of FIFA members and thinking, God, they play football here? What? I think Kitson Nevis, and thinking, God, this. And I was always interested in the underdog. Always growing up. I don't think it's a particularly British thing, although in sport, it's absolutely ingrained into the British mentality about underdogs. And I just like the story of Eric Muslimbani, the Equatorial Guinea swimmer at the 2000 Olympics. The guy who could barely swim. He'd never been in an Olympic-sized swimming pool before. I managed to interview him once for CNN, actually, which was that was like a guy. No way! Wow. Managed to track him down. He was absolutely brilliant. And these are underdog stories are your kind of bread and butter. And I was going through these FIFA lists of members and just thinking, God, knowing a little bit about the political situation in the place, you think, they play football there? How can they do that when this war's going on with this other place? What happens when they play that team? I mean, is that a rivalry? I mean, is it dangerous to go to those games? I mean, what about if I went there? What kind of story would that be? And then one that I came across was going through kind of MNOP, and then I came across Palestine, and knowing the situation. I mean, even having an entity called Palestine is politically explosive. I mean, it's not recognised yet internationally. It's called all sorts of various different names by international organisations. Of course, Palestinians call it Palestine. Lots of Arabs call it Palestine, but it's not officially recognised as Palestine, except in football. So, you know, you go into that, like, and then you start going down this rabbit hole of like, what? So how can, if there's an occupation in the West Bank and they're separated with Gaza, how can they have a league there? What's going on? And then you go there, and that was kind of the early inspiration of you know, doing a lot of these stories. So you can sit down and Google stuff, but you've got to what you've got to do is give yourself the time. Don't be afraid of it. It's like the first time when you open your computer and you've got a blank page for your first page of your book, which is quite scary. But don't be afraid to be sitting there and have nothing. You just got to give yourself a space, like one day every couple of weeks, to sit down and just, you know, brainstorm these things by checking lists of things. Wikipedia gets a pretty bad rap, but it is an absolute mine of information, not to quote, but as a starting point for the rest of your research. And then, you know, at any one time, I've got, you know, anywhere up to kind of 10 ideas bubbling around, some of which won't you know, make the grade, and others which will be turned into something, and not necessarily written either. It could be, last summer we went and did, I made 4 films with Sports Illustrated. We've got a new Sports Illustrated films division. And these were 4 stories in Africa. One of them, which I'd always wanted to do, which is about Western Sahara, which is this forgotten conflict.
I know all about it, but please keep going.
Yeah, well, I mean, it was, you know, obviously it's a hidden conflict, really. And so I went down to, and I'd always wanted to do something about the Western Sahara national team, because again, like the Palestinians, I mean, I've always been fascinated by unrecognized nations. Steve Menery, football journalist who writes for World Soccer, wrote a brilliant book called Outcasts a couple of years ago about, you know, the politics and the everything surrounding kind of unrecognized nations. And Kosovo was part of it, bizarrely, which has now become a member of FIFA and UEFA. And so we didn't actually go to Western Sahara. It was very difficult to get into. So we went to Algeria and to Tindouf in the southwest, which is where these refugee camps of Sahrawi people still live. I mean, hundreds of thousands living in the most, I can't tell you how inhospitable the Saharan desert can be in July. I mean, it was hot as hell, you know. And people are living there, and they don't want to go. They can live anywhere in Algeria, but they don't want to leave because they feel that if they leave, their cause is over. And so this conflict was still very much alive. And, you know,
it's been 40 years, just for the listeners. This has been, it's not like they've been there, you know, for a year or two. They've been there for 40 years. 40
years living in a desert. And these young people, I mean, it's kind of hopeless. The only thing that they have is this dream of returning back, because, I mean, a large part of southern Morocco is Sahara. The Moroccan government are very aggressive in pushing its claim for Western Sahara, even though, I mean, the UN, other international bodies believe there should be a referendum for the Sahrawi people in the south to vote on it, and it hasn't come to fruition. And so they live in this kind of self-imposed exile, living this kind of like, there's no water, there's no industry, there's no nothing there. It is just these tent cities in the middle of nowhere. And, you know, one of the most incredible things from going around the world and seeing football is just how football survives in these inhospitable places. And that was as inhospitable as I'd ever been, a place that I'd ever been. And yet you had people playing, there's this kind of effectively a kind of league system between the camps that plays on, you know, I remember when we went to this pitch, sand pitch with goalposts, I'd have to go on there and I was cleaning, you have to get rid of the rocks because I played in goal. Made a couple of great saves as well, I have to add. But one of the first things I had to take off was like this camel skull, because it's so hot, animals just like drop dead and they just leave them to die there. So you have to take all the rib cages and rotting animals off the pitch before you can play.
That's crazy.
You know, and this is something that I'd always wanted to do. It had been back burners, and this project came up, so that became a film which should be out in September, I think. And that became a kind of short, like 10-minute film. Another thing can become a BBC radio package. Like last week, I did a thing for the World Service about the first guy to ever win 2 European Cups with 2 different teams, called Miodrag Velodedic. Fascinating story. It sounds like a Serbian name, but he was born on the Romanian-Serbian border, grew up speaking Serbian. This was the most bloody border in Europe during the kind of 70s and 80s. Thousands of people were shot trying to cross Romania into Yugoslavia, because Romania was a police state and Yugoslavia was much freer. And this guy wins the European Cup of Steaua Bucharest in '86, then flees the regime, crosses the same border he grew up listening to people get shot over, turns up at Red Star Belgrade, knocks on the door, and eventually they believe him that they don't believe that he's married Miodrag Belodedic at first, because he's something of a hero back there. And but eventually they work out it's him. He becomes a star member of that team that had Mihailovic and the rest in it, and then wins it again in 1991. So the first player to ever do it. And then Ceausescu's killed, executed, and he can return back to Romania because he was charged with treason, which had a death penalty back then. So he couldn't ever return to Romania. But then he did, and he was part of that team that got to the quarterfinals of the '94 World Cup. And something like that, that's a story that I knew, and I was thinking, what's the best way of doing it? How can you, what gives the most, what puts that story in the best possible light? And actually, in the end, it was the radio. I'm gonna do a long read piece about it as well, but it was the radio that did it, because all those sounds of going to this village, the river that people would cross, going to watch Partizan, Red Star, and the sound of the crowd, and saying this is where he had turned up in 1986, and the interview I did with him, in Romania. So you've just got to have, ideas. That's the oxygen of a freelancer, and you've got to love those ideas. You've got to love researching and finding them and acting on them. And as long as you're not trying to interview Messi or Ronaldo or kind of, pretty much anybody who's professional in English football or big European leagues, you'll be surprised at what access you can get and how willing people are to talk to you.
I'm curious because you were in Western Sahara. You've been pretty much in every corner of the world. What languages do you speak, and how do you arrange for an interpreter? I mean, surely, do you just try to find the person that speaks English, or surely that's not it. So how do you get over the language barrier? My
language. What I find is I'm very good at learning a very basic level of the language of the place I'm in. So in the Middle East, I have very basic Arabic, but I knew how to be polite. I knew numbers. I knew how to buy things. And basically, you've got to convince a taxi driver within 10 seconds that you do speak more Arabic than you probably do, and then you don't get ripped off. So it's kind of like taxi level Arabic, or buying food. Buying food, the things that you need. So the very basic things.
No, what? Sorry to interrupt you, but yeah. What I mean is when you do you just, how do I put this? When you're going to Western Sahara, you arrange an interpreter.
Yeah.
They just follow you around the entire place, and also for that matter, how do you arrange all these interpreters?
Well,
because it must be a cumbersome task.
Yeah. Well, originally, you asked what language I speak, which essentially I speak English, and which in football is a kind of a lingua franca. So in the Middle East, actually, I didn't have any money, so I couldn't get a fixer, I couldn't get an interpreter, so I bodged along. And I was absolutely the only place where it was really a problem, not where people didn't really speak English, because most people kind of did speak a level of English because of the game. So the people involved in it did speak because, they all had agents or had to have, there's an international framework and network reviewing the FA. Often everybody spoke, or the top people spoke English. So I was surprised at how easy that was. The one place that they didn't have it was in Gaza. Nobody really spoke English, and that was a surprise because it's one of the poorest, most difficult places in the world to live. So in the early days, it was kind of just winging it, and which does restrict your ability a little bit to speak to exactly who it is that you want to speak to. But as my career progressed, then you could use you'd find a local journalist who you could pay as a fixer and an interpreter. So when we went to Western Sahara, because it was filmed, it's a very different. As soon as you get a film crew involved, and they paid for it, which is a first for me, because usually I have to pay for everything up front, and then you can claim it back later, or you do a number of articles to cover your costs. Once you're involved with TV people, then you have a budget to have a proper fixer and a proper interpreter. And so I knew Maher he's on Twitter. He's kind of an Algerian football expert. Grew up around the kind of Canada, Detroit area, like the Great Lake, all around there, kind of on the border. But from Algerian parentage, and knows Algerian football back to front, and speaks perfect English and Arabic. And so he came with us and was, he was there interpreting the interviews. But when you do something like that, when you do TV, it's a lot more organised, and it's a lot less free than when you just turn up and roam around and talk to people, which is kind of what I like doing most, and which is what I kind of hope I did with my books and some of my journalism, is that's real. You turn up, because the more obvious you are as a journalist, and the least obvious you can be is just you talking. The next is with a notepad, the next is with a microphone, the next is with a camera, and then finally with the video camera. And as you go up that scale, the more stuff that you have, the more equipment, the harder it is to be spontaneous, and the more nervous people get about talking to you, and the less spontaneity is involved in your work. So if I have interpreters usually for kind of written pieces, they'll come with me and they'll be part of the experience that I have. But with TV, it's very much I have somebody sitting next to me, ask the questions, and it's a bit more of a stilted kind of situation. But I mean,
in regards to you mentioned, just sorry to cut you off again, but you mentioned something I actually wanted to get to, which was the notepad, the recorder.
Yeah.
How are you transcribing or taking down these? I mean, some of your quotes are, incredible. So how are you getting all those down while still staying spontaneous, as you said?
Well, the one thing I should mention as well is that often I'm a very tall, blonde white man in a country where there aren't very many tall, blonde white men. So already you're kind of interesting and different, and not all that surprising that you're a journalist. So in the past, really since 2011, I travel effectively with a microphone, because one of the things I've been doing is the BBC World Service World Football Show, where I got a call one day because they found out that I was going to some kind of interesting places, and they thought, well, whilst you're there, take a microphone, ask some questions. So I do have this microphone that I walk around and talk with. So every single interview that I've done, everything that I've got is all recorded. So I just, and because that's a fairly small thing. And once you've got like other people and a sound boom and a camera, even taking pictures, because in the early days I would actually supplement my income by being a photographer as well. But I found that I couldn't be a photographer doing radio and taking notes at the same time. So I kind of dropped that. But, the microphone I found was kind of the sweet spot between being able to obviously be a journalist, at the same time recording everything so that it was an accurate interpretation of events, but yet still not scaring the horses so that people were nervous or weren't spontaneous with me. It was the perfect thing. So, I have a very small Marantz recorder which goes in my pocket, and this microphone, and that to me is the perfect, the Goldilocks zone for that kind of journalism.
Wait, which one do you have? I'm just curious.
It's a Marantz. It's a BBC. Well, actually, I've moved on now to Zoom recorders, but I mean, because my Marantz is just broken, so I'm using my girlfriend's old Zoom recorder. So Marantz is the kind of it's kind of like BBC standard recorder. It costs about £250. It's very simple to use, but there's also the Zoom recorders which Dutch journalists use and other people use, and I've been using them as well. Also very good if you have a band and you want to do home recording, I'm told.
Well, just, for the, if you're that type of person that does them both, I guess that's the perfect fit. So when you're traveling, what item do you always need to pack that you can't live without when you're on the road? Oh,
well, I mean, there was a period when I was doing 31 Nil where I kept on getting tear gassed. And I remember that I actually, before I left for the World Cup, I posted a picture on Twitter about what I was packing and laid it all out in front of me. And one of them, which for a while I always had, was a gas mask, because, it fucking hurts when you get tear gassed. So I had a gas mask. I mean, of course, you always have as light as possible laptop, radio recording equipment, camera, notepad, external battery, and for me, which is probably the most important thing, is factor 50 sunblock and a hat. Because there've been so many, I am extremely pale, and there's so many times that you can be out in the sun all day, and, you know, if you don't have batteries, you can get them from someone. But the amount of times I've got terribly sunburned, and that's just the end. So, you know, a gas mask, a bottle of water, a jar of peanut butter, because when you're out and, you know, doing your stuff, you know, often there's never food, and you've got to think of like something that you can put into your body very quickly that will kind of make you not hungry anymore. A jar of peanut butter saved my life many times. Water, obviously, and a little bottle of vinegar. Because if you do get tear gassed, that's what you've got to put under your eyes, which sounds counterintuitive, but it is what has saved me from temporary blindness on several occasions.
Well, I mean, I can totally I relate to the peanut butter. I can't tell you how many like hiking trips I've had peanut butter on, like, and it sustains you, you know, when you need it the most.
Yeah,
and it's so simple.
There's Kendal mint cake as well, but I don't think you get that far out of the north of England, which is an extremely sweet, sugary cake that a lot of walkers and hikers kind of swear by that they have packed in there. But it's difficult to find Kendal mint cake in Belgrade, so I don't have any of it on me.
Although, I mean, I'm curious to try it. I haven't really been up north or had any of the cakes yet, so I'll keep that in mind.
Good cakes up north. You should get up there. Because London is a representative of only a certain part of England, and there's just a lot more out there.
When you're away reporting a story, what do you miss the most?
Well, now now I have a family, and that's the thing. I mean, I think that everybody. I'm not a conflict, although I do report from occasionally. I mean, especially when the revolution in Egypt was won. In between wars in Gaza, and especially the Middle East. I mean, I have been to places where conflicts have been going on, but I'm not a conflict journalist. I don't go to war zones to report on the war. But there is a certain, I guess, adrenaline or rush that you get from those kind of reporting trips. And when you're younger, you know, there wasn't much that I missed. You know, I mean, I'd always had girlfriends that were at home and not doing what I was doing, and that was difficult, although in the end, it kind of, what I did almost destroyed every relationship I had. So I kind of course, missed my partner at the time, but equally, it often left on massive arguments. So it was kind of a blessing to get away. But now I've got a family, I've got a child, and I'm finding it, you know, increasingly more difficult to get away to do stories, and not because the time. I mean, me, my partner are both journalists, and we both work freelance, and so it's kind of perfect in that respect. It's more that, you know, this natural thing that you find when you speak to people who do conflict journalism or that kind of work, is that when you have kids, it does kind of change, and that's the thing I miss most now. I go abroad, and I don't want to be away for 3 weeks on the road to Rwanda. I mean, I love it. I love the buzz of going and doing those stories. I still get excited when I'm at a football stadium anywhere in the world, that kind of 2 hours before kickoff, and you're walking to the stadium and you've got your microphone and you can see the people going there and you're talking to people. And I love I remember one journalist was telling me, saying that they couldn't understand why I was going out and talking to the fans outside. And I thought that is, if anything, the least exciting thing is talking to the players, you know, because it's so regimented, whereas outside is where the real life is, and their experience is much more in keeping with, or chimes much more with me, and I think with people who read my stuff, and you know, it's I still get all that, but I find it's now my daughter, that's what I miss most. And before then, you know, there wasn't much. It was all about the story, and it was all about getting it right. And now there is this thing, and I think it happens. I talk to other people who were war correspondents, or who were people who are based in foreign countries and doing foreign correspondence work. Somehow, this is what happens when you have kids. It kind of changes you and changes the nature of what you do, I think, a little bit.
Yeah, I imagine that to be the case. And when I was reading your book, 31 Nil, I couldn't help but think the part that stuck with me, one of the things that stuck with me the most, was when you were stuck in Tajikistan in a prison. And I mean, I could have read an entire book about that just because I was so curious, like, what's going through your mind? Like, you think you have like not a simple reporting, like, crossover to Palestine, but like, that's not what you expect. So what, like, take me through your thought processes at the time.
Well, I mean, at the time, I mean, the filmmaker I was with, Stefan, a French guy, he was going to make a documentary. So he actually filmed. He had this like little mobile camera, it didn't look like a camera, and he actually filmed the entire thing. I don't think he made it into a film in the end, but there's all sorts of footage of us in this essentially being locked in this cell with no water and no toilet. I mean, it became kind of farcical in the end. It became kind of funny. It only became serious shit when they said they're going to take us back to Tajikistan, which meant we would almost certainly be arrested, and that's when shit got real. But eventually, you're not really thinking of the consequences, like, oh my God, what my family going to think, or what the people back home going to think. And that's partly a problem, I think, because you should be thinking that. There's something wrong with you that you don't think that. But equally, not having that fear of those kind of situations also allows you to do a certain type of work, and certain type of people have it and certain type of people don't. So there was, the fear only ever comes later, but actually the consequences, and it's not just then. I mean, that time was pretty scary. There are other times when, especially in Egypt, reporting in the aftermath, and the revolution was crumbling, and Morsi was about to be toppled from power, and I was in Port Said around the time of the trial of the people involved in Al Ahly massacre in Port Said. And there are people getting shot in the streets, and there are barricades, the city's deserted, and there are protests at night breaking the kind of curfew. And, it's only in hindsight where I really thought that was stupid to go. And really, I'm only rethinking about all of that in light of becoming a father. And would I make those kind of decisions now? And I'm not sure if I would. It does, like I said, it does completely change you. But there is, of course, there is fear. It's not kind of like thought of idiocy, because you've got to have some kind of mechanism inside you to judge danger. And I think I have a fairly well-tuned one to never go that far. It was a little bit off when I went to do something for the Bleacher Report in January, when I went to Gaza and there was a riot at a match in Rafah. And it was just these two groups of players and fans were fighting each other, and Hamas security officers are wading in and my fixer said, look, I know this situation, you have to leave now. And I was like, no, it's fine. I know I've got this internal compass, it's fine. Literally took one picture, and that's when I got grabbed by two police officers. They wanted the camera, I wouldn't give it to them. So one of them was about to break my wrist with a nightstick. I got taken away to the head of police. God, that was really scary. And that's when I had, actually, I can't do that. I've got to listen to it. And maybe my compass is a bit rusty because I've taken a little bit of time out to be with my daughter. So that, I mean, you've got to have a fairly good internal mechanism that can judge how far is too far. And I mean, that's trial and error. And I wouldn't recommend necessarily everybody going out and doing that, because you can get into trouble. But often that's when you find the most powerful stories to tell,
Yeah, I mean, it's those, unfortunately, that are the most interesting.
Yeah, it's often the way
to read.
The forbidden fruit tastes the greatest, right? I mean, that's the way it is.
And don't forget, that was just part one of our 2-part interview. And in the next episode, Montague talks about what didn't make it into his new book, The Billionaires Club, traveling to migrant workers' camps in Qatar, what surprised him while writing the book, his fears for the future of football, and the story he's most proud of writing. So don't forget to check that out.